All right, it is 12:01 and Brady is still admitting folks in, but we're going to go ahead and get started because we have a lot to cover today. I am Alex Hudson. I use she, her pronouns, and I have the honor and privilege of being the Executive Director of Transportation Choices Coalition. I will be moderating today's panel, and I'm going to take a quick moment to introduce myself and why I'm here. TCC is an advocacy and policy nonprofit that works at the state level to ensure that there are more and better transportation options for people. The intersection of transportation and land use is like peanut butter and jelly. Housing and land use is about the places that we are trying to go in our lives, and transportation is about how we get there, both in a physical manifestation, the mode that we take or the modes that we can't take, as well as the ability to really imagine opportunity and our ability to access it. Single family zoning creates huge barriers to having a successful transportation system, in addition to the barriers that our panelists will talk about in terms of the ability for all folks to have access to adequate housing that they can afford. So I'm really honored to have been asked to moderate this panel and looking forward to hearing the wisdom of our panelists. I apologize, there is like leaf blowing or something that's happening outside of my home, so such is the time, yeah. So before we get started, it's important that we take a moment and acknowledge that while we are all gathering here today virtually, our panel is joining us from the ancestral lands of the Coast Salish people, specifically the Duwamish people. Indigenous people are still here, many of whom are still fighting for federal recognition. Housing and mobility justice for all cannot be achieved without recognizing and honoring those that first cared for and made their lives in these spaces. As we work towards building a more accessible world, let us be mindful that we do so on stolen land. Today, we honor with gratitude the physical spaces which we occupy and the Native communities past, present, and future who live and thrive here. It's also important that we acknowledge the senseless deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and other Black Americans, and recognize the injustice of their lost lives as part of a deep and shameful history of anti-Black violence and white supremacy in the United States. Racism, police violence, and structural inequality are also housing problems. And as housing advocates, planners, developers, policy and decision makers, we must take an anti-racist approach to work. So take a deep breath into that. That's a lot for us to hold. Now we can enter into housekeeping. So each of our panelists are gonna give a presentation that'll last about 12 minutes. Questions should go in the chat below. The goal is to get to questions, and hopefully we can get to a couple at the end. This is going to be recorded and the video will be shared and available to you all later. And captions are available. So if you scroll on down, we're all pretty familiar with Zoom at this point. There is an ability for there to be captions for you. And I want to give a quick plug for an event that I think all of us should be really excited about, which is Seattle for Everyone is hosting Richard Rothstein, who's the author of The Color of Law, a book that I certainly really loved reading and got a lot of hard truths out of. The event is on October 12th, and it's a partnership with Town Hall. It's called The History of Housing Segregation Today, and reservations are already available on Town Hall website and the Seattle Seattle for Everyone announcements that are coming later this week. So I'm going to introduce our panelists and then we'll get started. We're starting with Donald King. Donald is a Seattle-based architect, planner, and educator with over 50 years of experience in planning, design, and project management. Among his many hats, Donald is a principal architect at Neymar Studio and former president and CEO of DKA Architecture. He is also an affiliate professor of architecture at the University of Washington College of Built Environments. And through his work at the Nehemiah Initiative and other projects, he supports responsive design to empower clients and communities. This UW-affiliated studio preserves predominantly African-American churches in Seattle's Central District with the development of underdeveloped church property. Rick Muller. Rick Muller is a UW Associate Professor of Architecture, also at the College of Built Environments, and a licensed architect. Commissioner at the Seattle Planning Commission, a 16-member body that advises city government on broad planning goals, policies, and plans for the physical growth and long-term equity applications for growth in our city. This body helps align the city with its own planning goals and policies with those of the county and the state through the Growth Management Act. And among his numerous publications and recognitions, Rick recently won a 2020 R&D Award from Architect Magazine for recent project design with Seattle City Planner Nick Welch that gives local homeowners the information they need to plan and build accessory dwelling units called AD Universe. And then we're also joined today by Representative Fitzgibbon, Washington State Representative. He represents the 34th District. He chairs the House Environment and Energy Committee and sits on a variety of other committees. Representative Fitzgibbon has been the primary sponsor of many successful state bills that focus on increasing housing capacity across the state, environmental stewardship, and updates to Washington's GMA. So thank you all for joining us, and thank to all of the attendees for sharing their time with us as well. With that, I am going to turn it over to Donald for his presentation. And just as a note for folks, each of our panelists is in control of their own presentations, so there may be just a couple of seconds of transition time as they all take the reins in their presentations.
Good midday, all. I am working now to share my screen. Is that something that I should be doing? I guess. Okay. I may need a little help with this. So this is in Dropbox now. That's not where I want to be.
I'll share your slides. So,
can you upload that, please? Mm-hmm. Thank you. I wanted to start today with the history and how history has a real integrated role in where zoning policy is now, particularly in single-family zoning. How it has been a history of over 200 years, actually nearly 400 years now, in process. It is not something that we can begin to change easily, but understanding our history will help us understand our current condition and our future as to where we're going. So are we ready with that yet? Okay, so we can't have a conversation on single-family zoning without the consideration of historic inequities in American home ownership. And our first slide will, am I missing something?
It should be showing. Is it up?
I know what it is.
I see the slide, Donald.
Oh, you do? Okay, so I must be out of the place here. So let me try and get back there. Anyway, you should see on, oh boy. There we go. Okay, so I'm glad we advanced to the second slide. So the slide here is a depiction of the very well-known history of the purchase of Manhattan Island. A bit of a myth, but a much celebrated myth in American history. Carries with it the idea that from the time that Europeans landed on this continent and conquest of the continent. Their superior race idea was that they could make better use of the land that others had than they could. This transaction for Manhattan actually became very popular and celebrated as a great thing. You know, how Europeans could basically, you know, slick others out of their land. This is a history that we should recognize, and a history that still stays with us today. Let's see. Okay, good. It's advanced. Our so-called founding fathers at the beginning of the republic, U.S. legislation, public and private policy has been exclusionary. This course was set by these free white men who, as at the signing of the Declaration of Independence here, but also, let's see, am I advancing here? There it is. Okay, good. And the Continental Congress, only landowners, many of whom were also slave owners, wrote the first laws of the land and held the privilege of the vote and set all the statutes that followed. Of course, there were those of us that also could not vote, legally could not own land, and that history followed. So the power of a power provided by the advantage to a limited group for over 200 years, and we all know and expect, is based on what the power elite decides. The Homestead Act of 1862 was a federal government incentive to move people west and settle territory taken from the indigenous population, who were ultimately forced off their land and onto reservations. Okay. During a speech made in Ohio in February 1861, President Lincoln said, "The act was a worthy consideration, and the wild lands of the country should be distributed so that every man should have means and opportunities to benefit his condition." Enslaved Americans were not permitted to apply for homestead land. Actually, we need to go back one. So their housing, which could look like single-family housing, often held multiple families of enslaved people. This is a photo of a house in slave quarters in Northern Virginia plantation.
Hey, Donald, you just want to say slide and I'll change the slides?
Yeah, okay, so that sound is me trying to hit the arrow on my keyboard. I guess that's not working. Okay, so next slide, please. So over the succeeding century, zoning in the new nation began to produce a uniquely American housing type based on this model of the English manor house. Single family home, plenty of yard, front yard, rear yard, side yards, plenty of landscaping. Was still more of an elitist upper income home, but it was the model, and it was the standard that all would want to achieve if successful in their life. Next slide, please. Urbanization, industrialization in the employment centers of the Northeast and Midwest grew with European immigration and the immigration of free people from the South, the city produced some unhealthy and crime-ridden environments. Escape from the dense multifamily housing of the city was the single-family home. To paraphrase Frank Lloyd Wright, who said, "Go out as far as you can, and when you think you've gone too far, go further." Next slide, please. His example then was Broadacre City, very low density, quarter-acre lots per single-family home, was that dream of the future and of the Garden City. This was not likely to happen in the dense urban environments that were created. The recently invented, not so much invented, but the recently popularized automobile was the way to get out of the city and out to places that could be this utopia of open space, of large lots, of single-family homes envisioned by many people at the turn of the last century. Next slide, please. However, the distance proved to be too far for most still living in the city, and the alternative was to plan a city that had single-family neighborhoods. So many cities had begun to expand from their original urban core, which was fairly dense, multifamily homes, into the ideal that we have for in-city living of single-family and single-family zoning, single-family homes and single-family zoning. Next slide, please. So this density also included a lot of, as we said, recent immigrants and those escaping the South in the Great Migration of African Americans. Next slide, please. So the model that was envisioned was something like this. The single-family home on the lot with the front yard, with the side yards, separate from the neighbors, detached, and also white, largely white. Next slide, please. Poor and Black residents of the city were often blamed for the failures of the urban environment, blamed for the crime, the poverty, and other things that they actually were greatly victimized by. Here's a sign from my old hometown, Detroit, where there was a lot of great unrest around integration of the urban environment. Next slide, please. With the help of the United States government and the Federal Home Loan Board back in the mid to early 1930s, guidance was given to banks and financial institutions on where the safe properties were to lend money and what was hazardous loans, or even loans that would not have federal guarantees in what we now know as red line maps. Here's a red line map of Seattle. As you can see, central Seattle, or the Central District, solidly redlined. Interestingly enough, there is this yellow buffer along the red edge, the eastern edge of the Central District, which is also part of what we see in the urban design and urban planning of the city as barriers, actually a buffer to resist the creeping of one segregated neighborhood into a white neighborhood. Next slide, please.
5 minutes.
So, good. So what ways of being able to prevent this creep and change and migration, intermigration of neighborhoods was to provide, government assistance in barriers, mass transit. Next slide. Next slide, please. And, oh, yeah, back one, please. And freeways. here's I-5, and we know either intentionally or unintentionally, Yesler Terrace was cut off from downtown. Public housing, which was the first integrated public housing project in the United States, had this massive barrier of I-5. Also, these transportation infrastructures, both mass transit and trains like in Chicago, or the freeway, which carried automobiles to the suburbs, was that way of getting out of the city and to suburbs that were also segregated. Next slide, please. So here's our model of suburban life. I'm showing two slides that are probably not the best models, but density is relative. Next slide, please. So do you drive 20 miles for this? Next slide, please. Under the guise of making a better situation in the urban environment, public housing then began to build larger, denser warehousing of people, particularly Black and brown people, into public housing towers. This has been considered a failure, and density was blamed other than the other conditions that the people in these homes lived with. Next slide, please. So let's get rid of that. Density is bad. Next slide, please. Let's take a look at this as the ideal. Now, this ideal has always been the picket fence and the single family home. We know that from 50s and 60s television. We know it today. It has never been considered a negative. Now we're thinking that maybe this is part of our problem. So let me get through the rest of these quickly. And
2-minute warning.
2 minutes. Okay, so I'll go on through the rest of these. As you'll hear next from Rick, you know, Seattle was a contributor to this history. Next slide, please. And we know that this impact is not only on people of color, but also people with lesser means who cannot afford the single family home and may not be able to afford to live in the city of Seattle at all. So some of our alternatives that we'll be looking at is that idea of the missing middle. You know, next slide, please. Can there be other alternatives to escaping the city into the suburbs and the long commutes that go along with it? And how can we then begin to look at ideas for ADUs, residential small lots, next slide, please, and greater density within single family zones. That does not necessarily mean building apartment buildings in single family zones. Next slide, please. So the Nehemiah Studio is part of the University of Washington's support for the Nehemiah Initiative. The Nehemiah Initiative looking at ways that faith-based property, particularly that in the Central District of Seattle, can be repurposed and developed for housing. This quarter coming up, next slide, please, we're looking at taking 3 of the church sites, historically Black churches, and examining them for not only how can they be repopulated with mixed-use housing, inviting many of their congregates back that may have left the city, keeping some from leaving, but also can we look at things like residential small lot zoning, develop cluster housing, and encourage home ownership. And next slide, please. So another site, and then the next one. That will then be our future for not only stabilizing neighborhoods, encouraging diversity, but also encouraging the wealth building aspects of home ownership. Thank you.
Great, thank you for that important history, Donald. We're gonna go over to Rick Muller now.
Okay, I think I'm all set. Thanks for all of you who are attending. Thank you, Donald, for that in-depth setting of the context through the history. I'm going to talk about single-family zoning using the Seattle Planning Commission's Neighborhoods for All report. I'm going to talk about some student work from a UW architecture research studio I taught in collaboration with the commission. I'm going to talk about some things happening in Minneapolis and Portland, and I'm going to follow up with some takeaways. And I apologize, I'm going to go really fast and it's going to get wonky at times, so bear with me. So in late 2018, the Seattle Planning Commission, of which I'm a member, although I speak only for myself today, released a report on single-family zoning, which I co-authored, and it included a series of observations and broad recommended strategies for increasing options in single-family zones. It reviews Seattle's zoning history, which mirrors cities around the country, beginning with its original zoning ordinance in the 1920s, followed by racially restrictive covenants and redlining in the 30s, the expansion of single-family zoning from the 50s to the 80s, and in the 1990s, the city allowed accessory dwelling units in single-family zones, and it also established the urban village growth strategy. Locating growth close to frequent transit, urban villages have had the positive effect of increasing per capita transit ridership, but there's a flip side. The urban villages were also used by single-family homeowners as a tool to ensure that their neighborhoods would not be impacted by future growth. As Donald mentioned, like virtually every U.S. city, Seattle's growth has been shaped by a systematic process of racial segregation led by government and the private sectors that denied households of color access to home ownership, the most powerful intergenerational wealth building tool available to families in this country. Today, a staggering 75% of Seattle's residentially zoned land is reserved for detached single-family homes at suburban densities, while a mere 25% of its residentially zoned land allows for multifamily structures. In Seattle, most publicly funded amenities such as parks, schools, playgrounds, and community centers are located within single-family zones, while most subsidized affordable housing, which could most benefit from these amenities, is located further away in multifamily zones. 95% of the city's growth in the last decade has been constrained to the 25% of its residentially zoned land that allows multifamily structures, while a mere 5% of the city's growth has occurred in the 75% of its residentially zoned land reserved for detached single-family homes. This is simply not an equitable distribution of the burdens of growth, but it's also yielded a dichotomy of housing types in which the city has a large percentage of detached single-family structures, a large percentage of large multifamily buildings, and very little in between. And this dichotomy has yielded a condition of haves and have-nots, in which those wealthy enough to afford a detached house with porches and private yards also have the best access to parks, schools, and playgrounds, while most others live in large apartment buildings on arterial streets with elevators, double-loaded corridors, and little, if any, access to open space. This inequity is problematic under any circumstances, but especially so during a stay-at-home pandemic. What's lacking are the so-called missing middle housing types: duplexes, triplexes, courtyard housing, and small apartment buildings. These ground-related or nearly ground-related housing types offer much-needed housing quantity and variety for a diversity of households while providing access to private and/or shared on-site open space. They would also have the same access to publicly funded amenities that single-family homeowners currently enjoy, and would offer more opportunities for affordable home ownership and the wealth building capacity it provides. The report also proposes several broad strategies for addressing this issue. These include ensuring that the city welcomed the growing diversity of household types, including extended households, multi-generational households, and households of unrelated adults who choose to live together in co-living or co-housing arrangements. An initial step toward this would be to rename single-family zoning to something like neighborhood residential that speaks to issues of neighborhood scale and form, and not to who should and shouldn't live there. It proposes more housing types with access to components of livability, such as schools, parks, and commercial districts. This would include revising the city's current urban village boundaries to reflect sound planning principles, such as a 10-minute walk shed, and not the political power of the adjacent single-family homeowners who negotiated these boundaries over 25 years ago. And expanding the number of urban villages around existing and planned services, such as the neighborhood commercial district in Madison Park. It also proposes new small-scale urban villages, or urban hamlets, as we call them, at existing or new small-scale neighborhood commercial districts. such as around downtown Tangletown, my neighborhood between Wallingford and Green Lake. It proposes retaining and subdividing existing large homes while building new large quote-unquote houses with multiple units. It proposes eliminating minimum lot sizes so that, for example, a senior who is aging in place could sell off their rear yard to allow for additional homeowning households. Last winter, I taught the Neighborhoods for All Graduate Research Design Studio with colleague Brad Corey in collaboration with the Seattle Planning Commission. The studio tested some of these proposed strategies in 6 Seattle neighborhoods as an alternative to the one-size-fits-all mandate of single-family zoning. The studio considered what is of most value in different neighborhoods, such as tree canopy and open space in the center of the block versus the retention of the existing housing stock. For example, one might incentivize the preservation of existing houses through infill projects in the backyard. Or backyard open space and tree canopy could be preserved by replacing or modifying existing houses. Or block ends could be incentivized for development. Or we simply encourage a variety of approaches with none incentivized over others. The studio proposed an incentive system to promote larger numbers of smaller homes in contrast to the large homes being built today by allowing more development capacity for more units. For example, one would be allowed maximum floor area for 1 unit, and that would increase for 2 or 3 units. More floor area would be allowed on alley and corner lots, reflecting the increased development flexibility these parcels provide. Finally, one would receive floor area bonuses for things like preserving the existing house or providing an affordable unit. Students worked in teams exploring urban design strategies at the neighborhood, block, and parcel scales. In the Bitter Lake neighborhood, a strategy of extend, activate, and connect extended the mixed-use character of the neighborhood commercial street into the residential area with higher density block end development. The alleys, a consistent condition in the neighborhood, are activated with rear yard infill development, and the excessively long blocks are made more permeable with through block pedestrian connections lined with new small-scale residential development. Students then worked individually in advancing proposals on specific parcels with a focus on prototypical development strategies. The block end development includes row houses with small roof gardens, stoops, and lower-level accessory dwelling units. A corner commercial space enhances walkability, creates a neighborhood destination, and turns the corner to engage the newly activated alley. Alley activation strategies include this infill building with 4 stacked 2-bedroom units, each with its own open space and access to a pedestrian-friendly neighborhood shared space, the alley. Further down the alley, a pedestrian through block connection, a pedestrian through block connection or muse enhances neighborhood walkability. Barely visible from the street, the project proposes a series of small row houses, each with its own roof deck and modest rear yard, quintupling the opportunities for home ownership on the lot. In the Othello neighborhood, displacement concerns are addressed through the retention of existing housing stock and the development of a variety of prefabricated modular units in rear yards to create new garden communities with roof decks, balconies, and shared open spaces. In Wedgwood, a co-living project provides a home for more than 20 unrelated adults with shared amenities in front and rear gardens. Structured as a limited equity cooperative, the project could provide housing stability to younger adults pursuing longer-term home ownership. So switching gears, let's take a look at what other cities, namely Minneapolis and Portland, are doing. So Minneapolis allowed triplexes on all single-family parcels as part of its comprehensive plan update in late 2018. And while the city received a lot of attention for this, planners there will admit that this had less to do with building a lot more housing than it was a political statement erasing the racist legacy of single-family zoning from their books. Portland, on the other hand, just passed their residential infill project, or RIP, in August, following 6 years of discussion and debate. The residential infill project explicitly focuses on incentivizing a variety of smaller missing middle housing types at scale. These include
5 minutes.
ADUs, cottage clusters, duplexes, and triplexes, but also allows up to a 6-plex with permanent affordability provided for half of the units. Similar to what I described in the studio, the code incentivizes a larger number of smaller units and places a cap on the size of new single-family homes. Now I'm shifting gears again because I'd like to raise the issue of what I call downzoning to upzone. This is where we allow more units, but we reduce the maximum floor area allowed on the lot. So Portland has done this with their residential infill project. Previously, the city allowed huge single-family homes, and I'm hoping these are not being blocked by the stuff. So currently, with the residential infill project, a duplex is less than half, the allowable size of a duplex is less than half of what was previously allowed for a single-family house. Even a 6-plex with 2 affordable units is smaller than what a single-family house could have been under the previous code. Now in Seattle, we used to allow a roughly 5,000 square foot single-family house on a 5,000 square foot lot. Now, with our recently passed ordinance, which I'm very much in favor of, 2 ADUs along with the house has an allowable floor area of about 10% less than what we used to allow just for the single family home. And with the so-called upzone from single family to residential small lot zoning, which Donald mentioned, we've reduced the total amount of allowable floor area by about 25%. Now I understand why we're doing this. We're doing this to make it more politically feasible to pass this legislation. But my concern is that in the next decade or so, we're going to greatly regret having substantially reduced the development capacity in our single family zones in the interest of allowing for more units. It's largely counterintuitive to do so. So finally, a couple of takeaways. The first is to develop a floor area ratio incentive system, or in other words, to allow more square footage on lots for a larger number of smaller units. Portland is doing this with the residential infill project. Seattle has done it with its recently passed ADU ordinance. To increase development capacity on alley and corner lots. Not all lots are the same. There's simply more flexibility on alleys and corners, and our zoning code should recognize that. We should remove minimum lot size requirements and use something like floor area ratio, the total amount of square footage one can build, to control bulk and scale, to simply increase the opportunities for home ownership in our single family zones. We should incentivize the retention of existing structures. We should provide bonuses for affordability. And we should provide bonuses for neighborhood amenities, things like through block pedestrian connections, commercial uses, and the like. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the conversation.
Great, thank you, Rick. And I'm turning it now over to Representative Fitzgibbon.
Thanks, Alex. And it's great to have that stage set by Donald and Rich's great presentations about the history and context of single-family zoning and why it remains an obstacle to more housing affordability and greater equity in Seattle. I'm going to move towards the just sort of recent action in the legislature in Olympia, as well as prospects for future action in the legislature on policies to improve housing choices, not just in Seattle, of course, but in the whole state. I think that it's really useful for us to think about the housing shortage in a regional way. I think folks, so much of our civic discourse focuses on what the codes are and what the zoning allows for in the city of Seattle, but I firmly believe that we're not going to be able to address the housing shortage in our region at all through action in Seattle alone. Even if Seattle were to eliminate single-family zoning across the entire city, I think we would still have a housing shortage if we don't have strong actions taken in other cities in the region. I hesitate to use the word suburban for so many of our cities because they're increasingly activity centers on their own. It's kind of hard to describe Bellevue as a suburb, even though so much of Bellevue's land is covered with single-family zoning still. But we're going to need cities like Bellevue and Kent and Federal Way and Linwood and Edmonds and Burien to take strong actions to grow the supply of homes and the zone capacity for homes in their jurisdiction too. Because as we know, as Seattle has become extraordinarily expensive and increased housing prices and rents at a much faster rate than other cities in the region, many low-income households, particularly communities of color, have increasingly been forced out of the city into more affordable communities, particularly in South King County and in Pierce County. So that's one of the reasons I think it's useful to talk about the policies at the state level and what we can do at the state level to try to address the legacy of racist land use laws and what their impacts are, what their impacts have been, what their impacts continue to be today, and what can we do legislatively in order to correct for some of those histories. One of the obstacles, however, to that is that the legislature is generally pretty reluctant to pass mandates on cities and counties that are as aggressive as, for example, as we see in Oregon. Oregon has a longer history of state control of land use policy than Washington does. Oregon passed its version of the Growth Management Act back in the 70s, and it's a much more top-down planning framework than Washington's framework. Washington's framework includes a presumption of validity for adopted comprehensive plans by cities and counties, although those can be challenged before the Growth Management Hearings Board. In Oregon, state government has to approve a local land use plan before it goes into effect. We also have, as I'm sure folks know, it's very common for a member of the state house or the state senate to have served as a local elected official in the past. A very common pathway into the state legislature is for someone to have served as a member of a city council or a member of a board of county commissioners, or often city councils, before they came into the state legislature. And so for that reason, you do have, and now this is not, it's not universally true of people who formerly served in elected office, but in general, most people who did serve in elected office prior to, in local elected office prior to serving in the state legislature are much more reticent to supersede the judgment of the state legislature for the judgment of city councils and boards of county commissioners. So for that reason, we see less rapid movement towards the kinds of mandatory policies that we often hear from activists in favor of more density, more affordable housing. The state legislature does just tend to move in incremental steps, and that's true in really every issue area, but that's a particular reason why it's true in the area of zoning and housing. That said, we have laws in place that do require local governments to look at the diversity of housing supply in their boundaries. The most important law by far in this category, of course, is the Growth Management Act. One of the mandatory elements of a comprehensive plan under the Growth Management Act, so, you know, of course, not just for Seattle, but for every jurisdiction in King, Pierce, Snohomish, Kitsap County, and most of the jurisdictions in the state. There's only 10 out of the 39 counties in our state that do not plan under the GMA. All cities and counties that plan under the GMA have to have a housing element in their comprehensive plan, which among other things includes an inventory of analysis of existing and projected housing needs that identifies the number of housing units necessary to manage growth, that identifies sufficient land for housing, including but not limited to, and then lists a whole variety of housing types, and makes adequate provisions for existing and projected needs of all economic segments of the community. Now that last line there is, I think, the most ambitious, and has also never been found by the Growth Management Hearings Board or state courts to really be enforceable. That while we do require that the housing element have local governments make adequate provisions for existing and projected needs of all economic segments of the community. I think one of the things that you will see a push for in the state legislature in 2021 is an effort to add more enforceability to that requirement, to say that the housing element of a comprehensive plan needs to have more teeth in it than just a head nod, as it were, to the goal of having affordable housing available to all economic segments of the community. So that's a change that would need to take place before that particular requirement of the GMA is going to filter down to the to actual zoning and actual development regulations. Now, somewhere that we have been more successful than in the mandatory front is by incentivizing local governments to take actions to grow the housing supply and to allow more housing types. So what bill that I sponsored in 2019, House Bill 1923, provided grant funding to any local government that took actions off of what we refer to as the menu of actions that a local government can take to grow the housing supply and increase the diversity of housing types in their boundaries. That exists today in RCW 3670A 600. Or 3670A is the Growth Management Act. This is a new section of the Growth Management Act. So among the things, so if a local government takes one of these actions, they become eligible for a $100,000 planning grant from the State Department of Commerce. For Seattle, $100,000, not really a meaningful amount of money. You know, they wouldn't say no to it, but for most cities in the state, even, you know, some of the relatively larger cities, $100,000 is nothing to sneeze at. You know, that could be an FTE for a year. And that might be when we look at that, as I'm sure many of you know who work in the planning space, you know, planning departments are squeezed and have been squeezed ever since the previous recession, certainly are going to be now as well. And in many cases, the obstacle to cities adopting more flexible zoning practices has not been a lack of political will. It's actually just been a lack of having the staffer to do that. I'll mention a couple of the actions on the menu in 3670A 600 in a minute, but one example that I would point to in the city of Covington, right now they are in the process of moving towards a form-based code. Of course, you know, in planning circles, that's a very smiled upon and positive step to move towards form-based codes as opposed to use-based codes. Covington is experiencing an extraordinary amount of growth, and, you know, has historically really been one of those kind of strip mall, you know, not transit-friendly, not walkable communities. That's not what they wanted to be. That was all that they were taking off-the-shelf zoning codes, use-based codes, and now they're moving towards what do we actually want our community to look like? We actually would like it to be walkable. We would actually like to have more diversity of uses interspersed together. So they're using their $100,000 planning grant under House Bill 1923 to adopt a form-based code. Other jurisdictions are doing other things. Kenmore is liberalizing their regulations around accessory dwelling units, for example. So there's a lot of exciting things going on that were to be honest, when we passed House Bill 1923, I was not sure that there was going to be a huge impact, because I just had accepted that the political inertia that stood in the way of city councils adopting more flexible zoning was going to remain, with the $100,000 or not. And I think what we found is that so many city councils did want to do the right thing and just didn't have the planning staff capacity to make some of these changes. But unlike, oh, sorry, how many minutes?
5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay, great. So just some of the actions, a couple of the actions that authorize cities to receive those grants include authorizing duplex, triplex, quadplex, sixplex, stacked flat, townhouse, or courtyard apartment in zones that are currently just single family zones. So, you know, we don't require cities to adopt, to end single family zoning jurisdiction-wide in order to be eligible for these grants. But if they take some zones that are currently single family and allow more of a diversity of housing types in that area, then they're eligible for a grant. One other thing that the bill did was, in addition to just authorizing these grants, it also provided safe harbor from appeals under certain other state laws. The State Environmental Policy Act and the Growth Management Act, that cities taking actions that specifically being these actions that were pre-authorized by the state legislature by passing that law, that those actions were not going to be appealable under SEPA or under the Growth Management Act. And that is another thing that has been a disincentive for many local governments that were reluctant to upzone, because they knew that oftentimes that opens up a new legal front that they just may not have the budget capacity to handle, to deal with a SEPA appeal or an appeal to the Growth Management Hearings Board. So authorizing cluster zoning or lot size averaging in all zoning districts that permit single family residences. That's another action on the menu. To adopt a planned action under SEPA. So rather than, of course, having every project that is above the significance threshold have to go through its own SEPA process, allow planned action to group a large number of projects in one area under one environmental review process. Authorizing a duplex on each corner lot within all zoning districts that permit single family residences. So that goes back to Rich's suggestion around how corner lots are a prime location where more housing types should be authorized. So currently we have we added a number of things to this list in 2020. The House Bill 1923 passed in 2019. We updated it with House Bill 2343 this most recent legislative session in 2020, and made that list even longer. So now there's I think over 30 actions that a jurisdiction can take, including authorizing 50 units or greater of zone capacity in areas in close proximity to a transit station, particularly a light rail station, or authorizing 25 units per acre in areas served by frequent bus service. So a wide array of options that different ones will make sense in different jurisdictions, but for which local governments that take these actions become eligible for a planning grant and have a safe harbor from appeal under SEPA and GMA. And so we're seeing a lot of progress in a lot of cities to take actions. Most of these actions are things that Seattle has already done, not necessarily citywide, but at least in parts of the city. And seeing those more flexible zoning options adopted across the region and really across the state, these are not just happening in Puget Sound area cities, is, I think, going to have a meaningful impact in terms of the housing shortage in the years to come, as well as in the opportunity for low-income communities, communities of color to build intergenerational wealth as there's more opportunity for more families to do that at lower cost. In 2021, we have another legislative session coming up. We have a couple things to get through before now and then, including an election. But I know that we'll be talking more about single-family zoning. And I know I saw Representative Nicole Macri on the call, who's been a champion for legislation authorizing missing middle housing in cities across the state. I know that we'll have that discussion again. One thing that I do think is that I'm trying to do, I haven't been using it on this call, but I think is relevant when we talk to lawmakers and to people who are less engaged in the housing discussion. Ending single-family zoning can be kind of a scary concept, because a lot of people hear that and they think that means that you're not going to be allowed to have a single-family home anymore. I try to use language a little more flexible, like allowing homeowners to build duplexes, allowing more people to do what they want with their property. That may mean a duplex or a triplex. That doesn't mean we're going to have to bulldoze your single family home, or that you'll never be allowed to build a single family home, but just allowing people who own their property to do more things with it. Now, traditionally, that has appealed to Republican legislators with the property rights bent. That's been less true in recent years, as the Republican Party has kind of moved away from a property rights focus and more towards a let's just leave things exactly the way they are focus. So that's may be less relevant in terms of reaching Republican lawmakers than it used to be. But nonetheless, I think that for the general public, helping people understand ending single-family zoning does not mean tearing down single-family houses or prohibiting single-family houses. It means allowing property owners to build more housing units if that's what they want to do. And that will have the effect of really helping address our housing shortage and enabling more families to build intergenerational wealth. With that, I will wrap it up.
Excellent timing. I am seeing a lot of activity in the chat talking about how people in municipalities really across our region are utilizing HB 1923 to advance important work for their communities that they're serving there. Couple of questions in here. We've got about 5 minutes left. So one that I think is really interesting here is sort of circling in and around the role of zoning as it relates to gentrification and displacement, and specifically how that relates to affordable home ownership. So I am going to read this question. This comes in the chat. Slavery, Jim Crow, racism, etc., have resulted in Black Americans having on average about 10% of the wealth of white Americans. Quintard Taylor and other history indicates that Black home ownership and business ownership in Seattle was the foundation of a thriving community despite wealth disparity. And it is documented that community was largely dismembered by gentrification and displacement. So what is the role of zoning in gentrification and displacement? And what can be the role of social government in creating home ownership as a way to address intergenerational poverty and really get at intergenerational wealth building? And what are some of the policy mechanisms that we can use to slow gentrification and displacement and achieve those home ownership goals? Rick, I see you've unmuted.
Yeah, I'm unmuted. The displacement question is an incredibly complicated one because the primary, certainly not the only, but the primary driver of displacement is simply having an inadequate supply of housing. And so if we put in place legislation that discourages the creation of additional housing, even if it helps with short-term displacement issues, could exacerbate longer-term displacement issues. And I think it's critically important that we keep that in mind. One thing that we really need to do is increase opportunities for home ownership for people of more modest means. And that's going to require some kind of intervention on the part of government. It's going to require using things like community land trusts and limited equity cooperatives and models that we have in place at scale, that they have to cease just being this kind of boutique approach and having a serious discussion about how we do that at scale. The other irony is that for years we used race as a strategy to not allow households to own property and own houses, and now we are prohibited from using race as it applies to housing. And that is a conversation we need to have. We need to be having a conversation about reparations and other strategies that acknowledge the racist history of land use policy and financial policy in this country and how we're going to take steps to undo it.
And Rick, I agree with that. There needs to be some remediation for what's happened, and that can be part of the strategy and policy. But the other things I want to talk about in response to what you said, Rick, is we have tools at hand, but we also have tools that we haven't put in place. We have tools that maybe we haven't considered. We've got to do that. We've got to really put on our thinking caps and find ways to get around the policies of the past. And some of that means recreating or creating new policies. Part of what we have suffered from is each time we, even with good intentions, we create new policies and new zoning actions to alleviate displacement, to provide more affordability, we find ourselves opening up to land speculation and more gentrification and more displacement. So I think we've always got to take a look at any policy that we want to put in place, including, how do we change the single family zone model and make sure that we don't do harm. How can we not do harm when we suggest these things? So let's take a look at the scenarios of what can happen what harm can happen from these proposals, and make sure that we've done as much as possible to prevent that from happening.
Absolutely. We are at time, so that will be our closing remark and our closing question. I want to thank everyone for spending their time with us this afternoon. Time is our most precious resource, and you have spent it educating yourselves about what we can do to create a better world, one in which harm is not perpetuated. So thank you all for joining us, and please look forward to Seattle for Everyone's event on October 12th with author Richard Rothstein, who wrote an excellent book called The Color of Law, where you can continue to learn about these issues, our history, and what we can all do to create a brighter future and make sure that our best days are still ahead of us. Thank you, everyone.